Now that we've generated our grain source and transferred the color from the geometry into the points, we're ready to set up our simulation. Just a quick note, here when we added the attribute transfer, by default this node will transfer all of the points and primitives attributes from the second input to the geometry of the first input. So if we check the geometry spreadsheet, we have the color, this is new, but we also have a height and mass parameters that are coming from this geometry. And those two parameters are from the Boolean node. And we won't need those parameters. So back in the attribute transfer node, you can take off the primitives attributes, and here under points, we can select only the color. That way we don't have attributes that we won't use. So back to our scene view, you can press tab and find the volume configure grain node. So let's add one of these nodes and connect it to the attribute transfer. Now this node will create a few very important attributes. Again, let's go back to the geometry spreadsheet. First of all, it will create a mass. We will need the mass on the particles. But more importantly, it is adding the isGrain attribute set to 1. And this way the solver will know that these points are grains. Now you probably noticed it also creates a sprite image and a sprite UV attribute. Let's go back to the scene view. And you'll notice these are the sprites, these spheres, that are by default resembling the grain size. For example, if we bring down the grain size to 0.01, you will notice that all these spheres are also this exact diameter. Now, they look nice and probably you may need them for some kind of rendering or some kind of visualization, but in generally, I don't really love them, so you can turn them off. Also, if you have a huge amount of grains, it may slow down just a little bit. I usually just turn off this property and I keep the points. The mass I usually don't change unless I want the grains to interact with some other RBDs. But in this case, since we will simulate only grains, leaving the mass at 0.1 is fine. The most important parameter that you need to take into consideration is the grain size, because this will determine the actual diameter of each grain and how it's going to collide with the rest. So more or less what I like to do is to keep them just barely touching without too many interpenetrations or large spaces in between. So now let's add a null. I will connect it below the volume constraints, change its color to black, and call it out grain emitter. And now we're ready to add our DOP network. So press tab and type DOP network, connect it to the grain emitter. And I usually like to change the color of the DOP networks to orange. And let's change the name to DOP grains. Now we can dive into the DOP network. I'm going to make some space here. And remember, by default, the DOP network is empty. It only has this output node. So first of all, let's add a gravity force. We will need gravity connected to the output. Then we can add a volume solver connected to the gravity. And then we will need a volume object. And this I will connect to the solver. Just make sure it's connected to the left input. And by default, the volume object has initialized the geometry to the first input. So notice this function, opInputPath. We have used it before in other courses. This is telling the node to use its first input, input 0, and bring in that geometry. Now, the initial constraints will be brought by default to whatever geometry is connected to input number 2 or input 1, but in this case we don't have any constraints, just the points for the grains. So this should be enough to create our first simulation. I will frame these particles and press play. So of course they will fall because they're being affected by the gravity. So remember, as usual, turn on the real-time toggle. And let's add something that can interact with the grains, just to see how they're working. And for now, I'll just drop a ground plane. So type ground plane. I will create a merge here right on top of the gravity node. And I will create a static solver to connect the rest of the static objects that we will bring into the simulation. Now, this static solver is not mandatory, but it's a good practice to add the solver, just to be clear that we're using two solvers. So on the right hand, I'll have the volume solver, on the left hand, the static solver. And I'll connect the ground plane to the static solver and the static solver to the merge to merge it with this volume solver. Now, just one thing, if you click on the merge node, you will notice that by default, the left input will affect the right input. So you could either change this option to mutual, so both objects affect each other, or you can leave this at the default and just make sure that the ground plane is on the left side. So click here on this arrow to bring the static solver up and thus have it connected to the left side. So let's press play and the grains should collide with the ground. Now, of course, this doesn't look nice at all. It appears like a bunch of marbles, but it's a start. So let's tweak the solver to create a more realistic sand. Now, I mentioned I usually don't like the sprites. I will turn those off. I'll go back to the SOP level real quick. Select my volume constraints, turn off add sprite, and dive back to the DOP network. Now, as we just saw, the default parameters of the grain solver are far from ideal. But let's select the volume solver and take a look at what we can do. So first of all, under sub steps, I usually increase this value. The default is 1. You can try with 5 or 10, depending on the amount of points that you have. I usually start with a sub steps of 10, especially in this case we don't have that many points. And this should make the grains much more stable. So let's press play. Of course, it's going to take a bit longer to sim, but for sure it's going to start looking much better. Now, let's scroll down a bit. And another thing that we will need to adjust is the collisions and the friction. So let's start with the friction. Let's increase the static threshold to 0.9. And also I will increase the friction for the ground plane. So select the ground plane, go to the physical tab. And actually the friction is 1, that's fine. I will just decrease the bounce to 0.05. And back in the volume solver, I'll even increase the static threshold even more. Let's just increase to 1 and try again. Finally, let's try increasing the dynamic scale to 1. This may be too high, but it will help to prevent the rolling of the grains and this marble-like motion. So now press play. Okay, so now they're not rolling. Of course, it may be too much, but we can play with these values. It will take some trial and error, but in the end, as usual, it's a matter of personal taste and what your specific needs for the shot are.